Okay, this is the first in a series of probably 3 or 4 videos that I'm going to be doing just to make sure that you're up to date on the sequence of events in the Second World War. There's a lot of stuff that we really should be able to get through in class that we just don't have time for. So I'm going to quickly run through a few of the events in this first video leading up to, I think we'll go through till about 1942. When you're looking at the Second World War, it's really important to make sure you're getting the chronology right because there are a lot of things that influence other things. So it's important to know what order they're happening in. All you really need to do if you want to understand history or the Second World War, all you need is a map and a basic understanding of human psychology. I've got a map here. I've got a whole book of maps, in fact. And so we're just going to start off by looking at the situation at the end of the 1930s. And we've got a familiar situation here in Europe. You can see, I'll just wait for the camera to focus there. You can see these red areas, Germany, Austria and Italy, all of which had fascist governments. The Nazi Party in Germany, of course, being the most famous example. The fascists were nationalists, and we remember from class that nationalists are people who put their people and their nation above all other concerns and are often willing to do quite violent acts in order to get what they want. All around them there are a number of states. Most of the countries you can see to the east of Germany, to the right-hand side of Germany there, also had their own dictatorships of one type or another. And the few countries that weren't dictatorships were mostly in Western Europe, including, of course, Britain and France. But you also have the Netherlands, Belgium, and the Scandinavian countries there. So that's Europe in 1939. We know a little bit about that already because we've looked at it previously. Let's have a look at Poland in 1939, because as we know, Poland was the first country to be invaded in what we think of as the Second World War. The German invasion of Poland was just one of a lot of little actions that were happening around the world, little wars breaking out between this country and that. And in 1939, they all seemed quite disjointed, unrelated to each other, but they would eventually join together to form what we know as the Second World War. The most important action that people usually think of as starting the war was the invasion of Poland in September 1939. And as you can see here, it wasn't just the Germans who invaded Poland. That yellow zone is the German zone of occupation in the west. It was the Soviets, the Russians, who shared a border with Poland and wanted to make sure that if the Germans were going to be lopping off bits of Polish territory, that they, the Russians, should also get some as well. And so a couple of weeks after the German army invaded Poland, which they managed to do quite quickly, the Russian army invaded from the east. But it was the German invasion that kicked off the Second World War because Britain and France had given guarantees to the Polish government that they would specifically protect them from any German encroachments on their territory. You can hear my dog drinking in the background there. So that's Poland in 1939. After the invasion of Poland, everyone was really excited at the prospect of a war, or perhaps worried. But there was a period immediately after that invasion that historians call the phony war, in which essentially nothing happened as far as Britain and France were concerned. And right up until the first few months of 1940, so this is a good 6 months after the invasion of Poland, there was relatively little action between Britain and France on one side and Germany on the other side, until the Germans decided that they had built up enough of their forces and were ready to launch some sort of attack, and they invaded France. And they did it, compared to the invasion of 1914, they did it extremely quickly and extremely efficiently, and this was mostly due to their superior tactics and communications technology that they adopted. The French were relatively conservative in the way they approached warfare, and they got beaten quite easily by the Germans on this occasion. We also had a large evacuation of British forces from this little pocket up here, and you may recognise this name, Dunkirk. It's quite a famous movie that came out, a very good movie, quite recently. And while the British army was evacuating from northern France, the French army was gradually getting pushed further and further back until eventually the French government surrendered. And instead of occupying the entire country, the Germans only occupied the northern half, this area in blue that you can see there, and the southern half they turned into an independent state, or at least on paper it was independent, and they called it Vichy France. And the Vichy regime, that part of France was never occupied by German troops, but effectively it was part of the Greater German Reich. And so by around about June of 1940, the war was over for France. And there was only one country in the world that was standing against Germany. But of course, as we know well in Australia, it wasn't just Britain, it was Britain's colonies as well. And there was still a pretty big war to be fought in the rest of the world because, as you can see, for example, here from this map of Africa, the European powers had extensive colonies in not only Africa but around the world as well, Southeast Asia, parts of the Caribbean. You can see from this map that the French owned a substantial amount of West Africa, these areas in yellow here, Central Africa there. British owned large parts of Southern Africa, right from South Africa all the way up to what is now, I guess that would be Kenya or Tanzania up here. The Italians owned substantial parts of Somalia and Ethiopia. Belgians had the Congo, where they were still doing unspeakable things, although not on quite the same scale as before. And in other pockets, various other colonial powers had their interests too. This is part of the reason why we refer to this as a world war, because in spite of the fact that the people of these countries in Africa and elsewhere didn't get a choice, they still were very much involved in the fighting and in the economic side of the war. And even though they don't get much of a billing in popular movies, hundreds of thousands of people from the Third World died in defence of Western countries like Britain and France. So while the Germans are sizing up the rest of the planet, they were besieging England, Britain generally, but England in particular. And they began what became known as the Battle of Britain. And for those of you who are doing your assignment on RWAF Airmen in the European theatre, and the European theatre is just what we call the area of Europe that the Second World War was fought in, as opposed to the Pacific theatre. For those of you who are doing your assignment on that topic, you'll be interested in some of the events surrounding this battle. Basically what the Germans were trying to do is defeat the British Air Force in order to invade Britain from the bases they had set up along those captured territories in northern France. You can't get ships across the channel if you've got enemy planes shooting at them on their way over, so it was very important to the Germans that they destroy the entirety of the British Air Force. But of course they didn't manage to do that, and the German invasion of Britain eventually was cancelled after several months of quite fierce fighting in the air. Let's see what we've got next. Okay, here's one that's relevant to Australia and Australians, and also relevant to those of you who are doing your assignments on either the Battle of Tobruk or the Battle of El Alamein. Both those battles took place along the North African coast here. This is what is currently Egypt, Libya, and going off into Tunisia, off to the left-hand side there. The British owned or controlled, they didn't formally have ownership of it, Egypt, and they also had control of the Suez Canal, which, as we know, even today is a very important shipping route. It allows merchant vessels to get from places like Australia to England without having to go all the way around Africa. And by this stage, England was very densely populated and was not able to feed itself, and so it was a net importer of food. So the Italians, who, as we remember, are in control of Ethiopia, the Italians wanted to create what Mussolini called a new Roman Empire, and they wanted to start by doing that in North Africa. And they launched a number of attacks from their possessions here in Libya towards the British armies in Egypt, with the objective of capturing the Suez Canal. Their problem was, and the British were to find the same problem, that there's only a very narrow band of land that you can attack along the coast there. The rest of this is desert. There's nowhere to refuel, there's nowhere to get water, there's nowhere to feed your troops. And so for a number of months, the two armies, and eventually the Germans, came in to support their Italian allies. The two armies were pushing each other back and forth, back and forth. And Australian troops, because Japan had not yet entered the war and so there was no reason to keep them at home, Australian troops were among the troops who were deployed to North Africa. The British generals believed, and probably rightly so, that Australian troops were better adapted to the desert conditions than British troops would be. And so they fought a number of very important battles, including Tobruk and El Alamein. And this was an area of the war where tanks were particularly important. By this time, the Germans thought things were going very well for them, and so they began to think about moving even further to the east. They had created what they called Greater Germany out of all the territories they'd captured in Eastern Europe. And in this area that used to be the Soviet Union, but which is now countries like Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, and Lithuania, you can see the German army gradually pushing eastward. And in June of 1941, they launched something called Operation Barbarossa, in which they launched a complete surprise attack against the Soviet Union, who thought they were safe. And the Germans, with their tanks and their mechanized infantry, moved very quickly to the east in an attempt to capture major Russian cities, including Moscow and Petrograd, or Leningrad as it was then. So they dragged Russia into the war when no one had really expected them to enter into it, which was a big mistake, turned out to be a strategic mistake. Because eventually they got stopped, and you can see that they got a fair way. Well into Ukraine, well into what is now the Russian Federation, but gradually the German advance began to slow down, particularly as the Russian winter kicked in. And in the next video, we're going to talk a little bit about places like Stalingrad and Leningrad, where there were major sieges. And we're also going to talk about other strategic errors that the Germans made and that the Japanese made as well by biting off more than they could chew during 1941 and 42.